So hello again, and welcome to today's SCOPE webinar, Swamplands in the Yukon. We're hosting this talk with respect and gratitude on the traditional territory of the Kwamandun First Nation and the Tonquatchun Council. My name is Sabrina Kinsella, and I'm the Acting Senior Science Advisor for the Yukon government. I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker today, renowned scientific and environmental author, Edward Struzik. Edward is a fellow at Queen's University Institute for Energy and Environmental Policy, a recipient of the Sir Sanford Fleming Medal for outstanding contributions to the understanding of science, and has been awarded the Atkinson Fellowship in Public Policy and the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship. While his work has taken him to many far-reaching corners of the world, he's also a former Yukon resident that I think some of our participants know, though he now lives in Edmonton. Today, we're going to hear about Edward's adventures in exploring wetlands around the world, about the knowledge these experiences have provided, and about the connection of this exploration and knowledge to our own context. It's sure to be an interesting presentation, so I won't delay any longer. Thank you for joining us, Edward.
Thank you. Let me just start off by giving you a couple of stories, the two trips I did that launched this book. The first was on the Thompson River on Banks Island. I think most of you know that's in the Arctic archipelago, the westernmost island. It was only the second trip that was done down the Thompson. We presumed that the first one was done by people in Parks Canada, but we couldn't find out any information about it by the time we launched off. So we had certain expectations when we started off because it's situated in the Queen Elizabeth Islands, which is a vast polar desert where less than 6 inches of precipitation falls each year. And the cold climate has led to the development of permafrost, which underlies all of the land area and exceeds 1,800 feet in thickness in many places. And that's how we started off, like this, in almost desert-like conditions. And we expected to see an awful lot of that along the way. But we quickly, as we emerged from some lakes which are the headwaters of the Thompson, things had started to green up pretty remarkably. It looked more like the north of the flow country of Scotland than it did any other Arctic island I'd ever been to. Lush verdant valley giving rise to 97 mosses and 83 lichens and many vascular plants at a vast wetland along the northwest coast. The time that we did the trip, there were more than 80,000 muskox on the island. There were prairie caribou, several thousand at that time, Arctic fox. I'll show you, this is not a great photo in focus, but we were surprised on a hike one day when we saw there were actually 14 fox on this hillside, but my lens could only bring in 10 of them. There was life everywhere. Arctic wolves routinely visited our camp, sometimes peed on our tents. We saw Arctic hare, lemmings, rough-legged hawks nesting in the area. Peregrine falcons. I love the way peregrine falcons deliver their eggs on a cliffside on a rock without a nest, and basically saying, "You're on your own, kid. I'll feed you, but that's about all." Ground nesting longspurs, sandhill cranes were everywhere. Pacific loons, snowy owls, hundreds of thousands of snow geese. And we even spotted a grizzly bear den on the north end of the island. That was a grizzly that obviously at the time had come over from the mainland. It was quite controversial at the time because most people didn't believe that there were grizzly bears on the Arctic islands. And now we know that they're beginning to move onto the islands fairly regularly. And the thing about this trip and 4 subsequent trips to Banks Island led me to think, what is it about this island that really stands out from pretty much all of the others? We do have some biological hotspots on Ellesmere, on Victoria Island, but they tend to be small, nothing like the Thompson River Valley. And I came to the conclusion that, peat, there was layers and layers of thick peat pretty much everywhere along the riverside and along the tributaries such as the Muskox River. And as every gardener and agriculturalist knows, is that peat is a wonderful medium for plant growth. It also insulates plants. It filters water very nicely. And I got to thinking that, maybe there is something here, a magazine article, maybe a book. I really didn't have enough. So I started visiting peatlands all across the country in the United States and in Europe. The second trip that really stands out was a solo kayak trip I did down the Nahanni, Liard, and Mackenzie rivers, a 66-day trip I did one summer. And it was extraordinary for the fact that, well, it wasn't extraordinary. In fact, it was pretty typical of what you might expect on a long river trip like that. Starting off with rain and snow, strong winds. By the time I got to the Mackenzie, I was really wondering, whether I had done the right thing. There was headwinds, lots of rain, lots of cold. And then as I started heading north to Norman Wells and Toledo, it got really, really hot. And as I think everybody knows, in the Yukon, the Mackenzie Valley can sometimes be the hottest place in Canada. And adding to my problems was the fact that, apart from the fact that there was no shade on the river, and also 20 to 22 hours of sunlight, my water filter failed. And Mackenzie, the Liard Mackenzie, are notoriously silty. And even if I let my water stand overnight, there was still a lot of silt floating around in that water. And so I had to really kind of be careful about how much water I could drink. I didn't want to fill my belly up with a lot of sand and silt. So I was kind of dehydrated, almost hallucinating in the heat. And as I got farther and farther north, this was starting to really weigh on my mind. And just before I got to the Rampart Rapids, before Fort Good Hope, I was virtually hallucinating. And then I thought I saw a reflection of water coming down a hillside. And as I looked more closely, I realized it was the stream. And I headed over to the stream and got out. And sure enough, it was cold, clear water that smelled very much like peat, like the peated whiskey I'd brought along and long ago dispatched. And so I decided, all right, this is a great place to camp. I'll, rehydrate and go for a little walk up the hillside. And as I walked up the hillside, there was this vast wetland as far as the eye could see. And it was remarkable for how much life there was there. There were, tracks of caribou that had recently been there, moose as well. I saw bear tracks, enormous number of ducks and geese. It was just overwhelming to see so much life. I saw more in about the 4 or 5 hours I was there than I had seen in about the previous 45, 50 days on the Nahanni, Liard, and Mackenzie. And I went back to my kayak, pulled out the stove and a box of a bag of Kraft cheese dinner, which I was saving for an occasion like this, because as anybody knows on long distance kayaking, you can't bring much other than rice and beans, and the fishing was not that great on the Mackenzie. In fact, it was terrible. And I was starting to cook it up, and then the ravens started to, a conspiracy of ravens started to caw and croak above me. And anybody knows anything about ravens, when they're active, they're looking down at something. And as I looked up the hillside, I saw a grizzly bear heading down along the stream bank towards me. And I had just one mouthful of the Kraft cheese dinner, and then threw the rest into the river and hopped down the kayak, looking for a new place to camp, but knowing I had a book here, because this was really an extraordinary place, one of the most magnificent wetlands that I'd ever seen. So now let's start with just a definition. What are peatlands? Peatlands are bogs and fens, and to a lesser extent, swamps and marshes that accumulate peat in waterlogged, oxygen-starved conditions. Peat is partially decayed vegetation that builds up over centuries. The swamping that came with deglaciation was a major driver of peat formation. And you see it right in the Yukon. The melting of the Lowell Glacier is a contemporary example of what began to happen North American wide 12,000 years ago when the last ice age ended. This is two photos I took, one in 1980 when I was working in Kluane National Park, and the other in 2015 when I returned, both shots taken from Goatherd Mountain. And you can see how much ice has disappeared in that very short period of time and all the swamping that has occurred there in the lake at the toe of the glacier. So if we fast forward, it's going to look more like this former glacier in the Ragged Range on the Yukon Northwest Territories border. That water in the lake will eventually drain out, and then you're just going to start getting mosses and other different plants, vascular plants, starting to take over and creating a peatland. And mosses, such as sphagnum, are the foundation of peat. And they are really neat. Some mosses can hold up to 25% of their weight in moisture and survive drought and extremely cold temperatures. This is a moss on a creek that is drained out on Ellesmere Island in the high Arctic. And you can see the mosses are just hanging in there. Bryologist Catherine Lafarge regrew a moss that was buried under a glacier in the high Arctic for 400 years. So they're pretty resilient. They are also, for want of a better term, serial killers. They snuff out vascular plants by taking up positively charged ions such as calcium and ammonium while releasing hydrogen ions. And as long as there's sufficient water, mosses will grow upwards and outwards, shooting out capsules that contain hundreds of thousands of spores. They really are the gunslingers of the peatland world. Nothing can shoot them down except we're beginning to learn this is reindeer lichen, a fungus and algae in one symbiotic relationship. It seems to be the one living body that can actually control the spread of mosses. And peatlands are found mostly in the Northern Hemisphere, but they're also found pretty much everywhere, almost as far north as you go in the high Arctic. This is a peatland fen at Strathcona Fjord on Ellesmere Island. This place has as many as 66 frost-free days. It's a real hot spot. The Alki Swamp on the Hawaiian island of Kauai is a classic example of a tropical peatland. Indonesia, Africa, and parts of the Amazon have peat, and as does the Mojave Desert, where there's a fen that is still being sustained by glacier water that is 15,000 years old and is still in the ground percolating up here. Coastal marshes such as Cape Cod and Chukujibujawak in New Brunswick, the Great Dismal Swamp, Virginia, North Carolina, 20,000 feet high at the base of the Sayama volcano in Bolivia, the Zogi Marsh in the eastern part of the Tibetan Plateau, Isle of Skye, Scotland, and many places in Britain, Belarus and many parts of Northern Europe. Russia contains the largest peatland area in the world. And we got a lot of peat in the Yukon. Anybody that's been to the Burwash uplands knows that it's a bit of a struggle hiking over what looks like really, really hikeable territory until you get down into the lowlands and then you're starting to squish through peat. Joe Creek, Yukon-Alaska border. It's a wonderful peatland that spreads out from that creek that drains out of Alaska. The Mush Lake wetlands, Indian River near Dawson, photo borrowed by the folks at CPAWS in Yukon. Ivivik National Park, there's a wonderful story behind this. I was asked to join at Parks Canada warden and hiking from Babbage Falls to Margaret Lake, basically across Ivivik National Park, and scoping out the possibility of giving hikers an opportunity to do this. And I think it's about 55 kilometers, but we never made it. I think we made 8 kilometers in 5 or 6 days. It was just impossible trying to make any distance in those peatlands. And when we tried to do some ridge walking, there just wasn't enough water up in the hillsides and mountainsides to sustain us. And so we ended up giving up and Well, not entirely, but then a big storm came in. And so I think after 9 days, we just decided to call in the helicopter and get the hell out of there. I'm not sure I'd ever try that again, but beautiful country. Peatlands represent 90% of the wetlands in Canada and cover about 113 million hectares. The Inuit harvested peat to build or insulate houses. Indigenous women gathered moss for diapers and sanitary napkins. The Vikings and the US Navy used bog water on long voyages. It's significant because when sphagnum dies, it releases polysaccharides, which block bacterial growth. And this helps keep the water fresh. And it also prevents organic matter like bones, skin, wood, fur, and food from succumbing to decay. It's why so many centuries-old bodies have been unearthed and nearly perfectly preserved in bogs in Northern Europe, Russia. We see some of this in Canada with some Ice Age animals. It's also why we know that this place on northern Ellesmere Island in the high Arctic looked like this 4.5 million years ago. And I think this is important because really, if you want to understand what an Arctic peatland landscape is going to do, you have to understand its history. It's pretty beguiling. Peat was once and still is used as a source of fuel. It explains why the Netherlands was such a superpower in the 17th century, chasing the British and Spanish fleets all around the North Atlantic and the Atlantic. And bogs and fen were also seen as the haunts of will-o-wisps, jack-o'-lanterns, and moss people. One of my favorite is one that my mother told me about when I used to play shinny hockey on a bog near our house. And she would tell me that Mora or Kikamora would get me after dark when she wakes up. When she was brewing beer, fog rose over the bog. You know, there's the Jersey Devil, which is a legendary swamp creature. Many people in New Jersey still believe exists. It was made famous by an NHL hockey team, which the New Jersey Devils, which adopted the name, and by Bruce Springsteen. You should watch the video, A Night with the Jersey Devil. That's pretty neat. So peatlands have suffered from a bad rap. They were as evil as Fenians were predicted to be in Britain. Both needed to be eliminated, as the Illustrated London News suggested. Fenianism, they wrote, is sufficiently sagacious to foresee that justice to Ireland is death to itself as naturally and as certainly as draining of the marsh annihilates the will-o'-wisp which danced upon its surface. American and Canadian settlers brought this ethos and superstitions to the New World. William Byrd claimed that the air above the Great Dismal Swamp on the Virginia-North Carolina border was so noxious that birds flying over would fall from the sky. He proposed that it be drained and turned into farmland. And George Washington, before he was president, was the head of the first company that tried to drain the Great Dismal Swamp. His company used enslaved people to dig drainage canals and to cut down trees. And many were hunted down by dogs. For others who escaped capture, the swamp was a shortcut to freedom, the beginning of what we know of as the Underground Railroad. They hid in the deepest, darkest parts of the swamp before finding their way to Canada. Many, we're just discovering now in recent years, stayed and raised families. Why? Because there was a lot of food and really good water there, and the slave owners really weren't interested in delving into the deepest parts of the swamp to find them. So several generations of family live in these places. But leading agriculturalists such as Henry Flagg French saw peatlands as the miasma, unhealthy soils, the poison of unwholesome water. And Flagg invented what we still use today, the French drain, to drain water. It led to the Swamp Acts of 1849, 1815, 1860, and the drainage of 65 million acres of peatlands in the US. By the 19th century, most of the Atlantic white cedars in the peatlands were gone. Peatlands like the Great Black Swamp in Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio disappeared, as did the Wainfleet Bog almost in Ontario. American cities such as New York drain peatlands for park and urban development, but they also drain them for public health reasons. They firmly believed that cholera and other diseases came from that miasma rising from those unhealthy soils. And so Central Park was once bogs and fens and was completely drained. I think there was 5 million cartloads of soil and brush and trees that were taken out of there. Canada did the same. In 1906, the Department of Mines became interested in the possibility of using peat, such as that found at Alfred Bog west of Ottawa, as a source of fuel for locomotives and home heating. They also looked at the possibility of doing the same in the Yukon, but found that the peat was just too inaccessible. When all this eventually failed, scientists in the 1950s were brought in by the National Research Council of Canada to deal with what was called the muskeg problem. The quote from the Research Council at the time was, Canadians must learn how to build engineering structures on muskeg, how to drain it, and perhaps most of all, how to travel over top of it. And they brought in energy companies and utilities and forestry companies to try to figure out ways of draining these ecosystems. And unfortunately, too many Canadians have tried. The low point, I think one of the low points, it came in the 1970s when university scientists came up with a plan to dump waste oil and chemicals associated with the search for oil and gas in the Arctic on Ellis Ringness Island. And why? Because they concluded the plant and animal productivity was low. So peatlands now represent just 3 to 4% of the Earth's landscape. So what's so special about a peatland? I think probably from a climate change perspective, the most important thing is that they store twice as much carbon as all the world's forests combined. The Hudson Bay and James Bay lowlands store 5 times more carbon than the equivalent area in the Amazon rainforest. And peatlands filter water more efficiently than forests do. Not to knock trees, but peatlands are better water filters. And it's one reason why the Great Lakes are being choked by algae, with the Great Black Swamp gone, Wainfleet Bog and other bogs along the Great Lakes having been drained. So all of those nutrients coming from fertilizers that are used by farmers no longer have a filter, and they just go straight into the Great Lakes. And this is the kind of choking of the waterways that we're seeing now. A healthy peatland, I think this is important to a lot of Yukoners, is it can stop or slow wildfire. The Horse River fire in Fort McMurray of 2016 was a classic example of this. Firefighters at the time thought that they could get control of that fire as it passed through a sloshy peatland just outside of Fort McMurray. What they didn't realize at the time was that the forestry department had drained that peatland in order to grow trees, an experiment in commercial forestry. And so when that fire got to that peatland, instead of being stopped or slowed, it actually accelerated. And it's one of the reasons why most people weren't prepared for how fast that fire entered Fort McMurray. Had that peatland been there and been healthy, it may have slowed the fire long enough for the firefighters to get on top of it. Instead, what we got was one of the worst natural disasters in Canadian history. Peatlands can mitigate flooding. A classic example of this is in Calgary in 2013. One of the reasons why it flooded so badly was that Calgary, in order to make way for subdivisions, businesses, mosquito control, they drained about 80 to 90% of their peatlands in and around the city. And so when that rain on snow event occurred and all that water came gushing out of the Rockies, it essentially, there was nothing there to sop it up. The sphagnum, when you consider it can absorb 25% of its weight in moisture, may have mitigated the impact of that flood. But it could have been a heck of a lot worse, because Sherry Westbrook of the University of Saskatchewan has put out a paper that shows that had the peatland in the Sybil Fen not held back so much water, it would have also gushed downstream and made that made that flood a heck of a lot worse. We saw the same thing happening in BC last fall when Abbotsford flooded. Many people don't realize that Abbotsford was built on drained Sumas Lake and the adjoining peatlands. And so when that huge rainfall came, they just didn't have enough pumps to pump the water out. Water loves gravity, and so it just came back where it naturally goes. Peatlands also represent critical habitat for fish and wildlife like caribou, and for which I should say, studies have shown that between 40 and caribou spend 40 to 60% of their time in peatlands, and for good reason. They feed on lichen in the winter. It's also a refuge for them during times of fire, and predators as well. Predators have a harder time sloshing through peatlands to get at caribou. And it's also good for barren ground grizzlies that rely on caribou for food. This is a shot of a caribou that had been recently buried by a grizzly that we had, Andy DeRoche, who I was with, and Mark Edwards, had tranquilized, and we followed its tracks back. So this 200-pound bear had downed this 750-pound caribou elk and buried it. It was quite fascinating to see the tracks, because what it did was it stripped all of those spruce trees in the background, the lower branches, walked back and created layers of branches on top of the caribou, and then put on a pile of snow, went back, got more branches stripped off. So this whole adjoining area, all the closest trees to this cache were stripped of most of the branches 12 feet down. And also for berries, which thrive in peatlands. If you want to pick blueberries, cranberries, cloudberries, you're going to be most successful in peatland ecosystem. Apologies for that. What I'd like to point out, if the barren lands are so barren, then how can females produce as many as 3 cubs? It really isn't. It's just sort of the value that we attach on it. We don't see things of value in these peatlands, and yet it can produce all of this life. Look at the Hudson Bay lowlands, where 1,000 polar bears live in summer and fall. And you have female polar bears denning in peat in the lowlands. One of my great ambitions in life was to actually get inside of one of these dens, and a biologist for the government of Manitoba obliged. We flew in by helicopter, looked around to make sure that the den was empty, and I ended up crawling in, having a look around, and then got out, and we got back in the helicopter. And as I was going through all the digital photographs I had taken, the helicopter pilot was poking me, and we were just hovering above the den, and he poked and said, "Look, what do you see behind the tree?" And I don't know if you can see it, but that's the rear end of the polar bear that was in that den. She actually hadn't left. She was watching us the entire time. And but in the lowlands, you have both migratory tundra caribou and woodland caribou in the same place. And wolves prey on caribou and bear cubs. Fox feed on what's left behind. The lowlands have 300 plus species of birds. 1 to 3 billion birds fly north to breed in the boreal. And you see that a lot of the wetlands at Mush Lake in the Yukon and other places. The world's highest abundance of peat-loving palm warbler, and very likely a high proportion of the global population of the mysterious yellow rail, a small chicken-like marsh bird that is rarely seen and little studied. And you've got orchids and insect-eating sundews and untold numbers of moths. A moth that the Ami borer that was thought to be extinct was found in 2009 in a fen, and many more have since been found in fens across Western Canada and now Ontario and Quebec. And butterflies. Did I mention mosquitoes? There's an awful lot of them in fens. That's why a lot of people avoid them. So what's the future of peatlands in the warming world? Well, scientists predict that the southern boreal, 300 to 500 kilometers of the boundary will be gone by the end of this century if it continues to warm as fast as it's been warming. And at the northern end, peatlands that we know will be transformed. And in fact, they're already undergoing dramatic changes, because as frozen peatlands thaw, landscape slump and carbon is released. This is in Trail Valley Creek, just northwest of Inuvik. This is on Banks Island. And I think probably the most vivid example of this was 20 kilometers north of Fort McPherson on the Peel River, when a slump eroded to the edge of the lake, about half the lake volume, estimated to be very large, drained in about 2 hours by pouring water over the slump head wall and forming a temporary waterfall 10 to 15 meters high. And all of the debris ended up going 5 kilometers downstream into the Mackenzie Delta. So when wildfires come, as beginning to come to the tundra, it gets worse. Hillsides like this one in Alaska collapse. The northern boreal forest will also be impacted. This is patches of melted permafrost near the Scotty Creek Research Station, just outside of Fort Simpson in the Northwest Territories. And what you get are drunken forests where roots are no longer cemented into the permafrost. And so they lean up against each other. And as this thawing advances, the peatlands start filling up with water, and drunken forests become drowned forests. And in some cases, we already know that it's been driving animals away. Following the 2014 fires in the Northwest Territories, there was a massive amount of water drained into the Mackenzie Bison Sanctuary, and the biologists that did the survey the following year couldn't find any of the estimated 700. They'd all basically got out. Some were on the highway, others were heading towards Yellowknife. There was just too much water in the sanctuary for their liking. And thawing peatlands are also a major source of methyl mercury that could contaminate downstream aquatic ecosystems. The large store of mercury in peatlands could be a source of mercury for over a century, even if mercury emissions are dramatically reduced. And scientists are already detecting it in the food chain. Levels of mercury and other contaminants are increasing at a greater rate in smaller lake than the larger bodies, such as Great Slave Lake and Great Bear Lake, and presumably Klawani Lake. And it's getting into the big fish where it accumulates over time. This is a lake trout that was caught in Great Bear Lake. Rapidly thawing permafrost can also release acids that break down minerals in peatlands and in the water. And so it can turn, fairly neutral water bodies into very acidic water bodies. Some of the most acidic water bodies are found in Yellowstone National Park, where virtually no plants can grow and obviously no fish can thrive. So these are the changes that we can anticipate happening more frequently down the road. It does not help when we build mines on mountain peatlands, such as this one on the Yukon Northwest Territories border. It's been now abandoned. The Canadian government is on the hook for reclaiming it, untold amount of money. And we also know that the tailings pond is leaking. And some of those tailings, if they get out of control, could actually get into the Nahanni River system. This is another photo by the folks at CPAWS of what's happening in the Indian River area near Dawson. And in the Hudson Bay lowlands, we now have 18 companies and individuals holding over 13,000 active land claims or mining claims in the Hudson Bay lowlands. So what's in store for the future? There's still so much really know that we don't know about these peatlands. We do know that the thawing that takes place is irreversible. There's not anything that we can do once things thaw out unless the world goes into another ice age era. But there are fascinating things that we learn almost on a yearly basis here. The pitcher plant, which is a common northern plant, we've only recently discovered that they actually consume juvenile salamanders. A University of Toronto botanist saw this happen in Algonquin National Park. We never knew that. We also know that the Massasauga rattlesnakes, which are critically endangered in Canada, den in peat. Makes sense because peat has a high insulation value. And so that's how they are able to survive a Canadian winter. And as I said earlier, this moth was thought to be extinct until one was found in a fen in 2009, and dozens more have been found since then because now we know where to look. Well, the world's largest tropical peatland was discovered in the Congo in 2017. And Dave Cooper at Colorado State and his colleagues have discovered thousands of mountain fens in the Rockies of the United States. And he predicts, believes that we could find an equal number in the Canadian Rockies and in the Yukon if only we looked. Remember, this happened, his discoveries have just been made in the last 10, 20 years. We've got beavers now building dams on the tundra peatlands, such as Trail Valley Creek. When I was there just before COVID, there were 7 dams on this creek. Absolutely remarkable. The good news is that unlike sea ice glaciers and ice caps, we can restore peatlands. There's scientists are working on this now. It's really a matter of bringing in water to where it used to be and having enough of that groundwater and rainwater to sustain it and the seeds that are needed to grow the plants. It's cheaper and more effective than growing trees. And we need to protect and restore peatlands. The Chinese are doing the Zogi Plateau, as many countries in Europe are doing now. Russia is, or rather was, rewetting its peatlands with the help of Germany. The primary reason being not to mitigate climate change, but to slow or stop the wildfires that are running rampant across Siberia. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is restoring the Great Dismal Swamp and other coastal peatlands because of rising sea levels, and they're hoping that the peat will absorb much of that water and buffer those ecosystems from that rising seawater, and also to restore some of the biodiversity that's beginning to disappear from those places. Here in Canada, we're in good shape because we still had a lot of pristine peatland, the Yukon being a classic example, as is the Northwest Territories. So really now's the time to take action. And I'm encouraged because I go back to the beginning of my story, is that when I was looking for a way to conclude this book, I decided to go back and try to find out more about the Rampart Rivers and wetlands, and discovered that a former friend of mine, Steve Cackway, the former premier of the Northwest Territories, was working with the Sawtooth people to have 10,000 square kilometers set aside as a protected area, even though there's a very high possibility that oil and gas could be extracted from that area. And the conclusion among the people in the Sawtooth region was that it held more value for the food and fish and pharmaceuticals that it offered them than for, say, 10 or 15 years of oil going south. And so once again, we're seeing Indigenous people in Canada, such as those in the Yukon, the Hudson Bay lowlands, and other peatlands in Georgian Bay, taking action that we should be supporting and taking ourselves. So thank you very, very much for this opportunity to talk about my book.
Thank you. So, some great stories and great information in there. So really appreciate you sharing. I'm sorry, I've had a little bit of an internet problem while you were speaking, but so you'll see I'm connected by my phone as well as my computer, and I'm hoping this will get us through the discussion portion. So just a reminder to participants, you can enter a question into the Q&A or the chat for that matter, or you can certainly raise your hand and I can unmute you if you'd like to ask a question directly.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Yeah, something just went funny on my screen here.
Okay. Yeah, of course, it's in the middle of presentations that glitches occur.
If there are questions, can you read them out? Because I can't see the screen here for some reason.
Yeah, so far we've got some thanks and greetings in the chat. Some people saying hi. Here, one question for you. Hi, Ed, would you consider peat to be a fossil fuel?
It is. I mean, it's one stage away from being coal, and it is currently, I think, provides 5% of Ireland's energy needs, much more in Estonia and in Finland. Unfortunately, that peatland in the Congo, which is the largest in the world and was discovered in 2017, the Republic of Congo is looking at draining those peatlands to harvest peat to create electric generating stations. And it's one of the things, you know, that they'll probably get money from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank to do it, where they'd be better off using other sources. But yes, it is a fossil fuel, and it's a pretty dirty one as well. There are different grades of it. And the worst of it really does cause emits an awful lot of carbon. The other part of that equation is that once you harvest it, what you've left in the ground also gives out an awful lot of carbon, because once it's exposed to oxygen, it releases that carbon. So a disturbed or degraded peatland just keeps on giving to the atmosphere and accelerating climate change.
Thanks very much for that. Another question's come in the chat from Skeeter Wright. He's asked whether you've had a look at the proposed draft wetland policy, presumably Yukon's policy referring to there.
Yeah, I've been following it. I'm interested to see how it all unfolds. The problem with policies like that is that I'm hoping they don't make the same mistake. And remind me, it hasn't come out yet, has it? I mean,
only in draft form.
Right. The problem with a lot of these policies that they are often done, and the provinces are a classic example of this, independent of what else is going on in the ecosystem. So there is a policy, for example, in Alberta, is that you cannot drain a wetland without somehow mitigating it or restoring it. And in the oil sands, they've essentially just not done it. I mean, they've tried and they've failed spectacularly in the past by basically fooling people. So they drained a peatland, but then they would fill it back in with earth and then put some grass on it and then put some bison on it and invite the media to say, isn't this wonderful? We've restored this ecosystem. Now people can go hunting and whatnot or whatever. But the reality is that it's not a peatland. It is simply a grassland with artificial grass and bison. Not the worst case scenario, but it's certainly does not provide all those other ecosystem services that peat offers, such as, you know, slowing or stopping a wildfire, filtering water, habitat for critically endangered species such as caribou. So this is what I think that is a failure of these policies, is that they do not do a true environmental accounting of what peatlands offer us and the environment. And so another example, Nalcar, the Newfoundland-owned energy company, is building, you know, the multi-billion-dollar Muskrat Falls Dam, and it's going to flood and destroy innumerable peatlands. They admit it in their environmental impact assessment, but they have not evaluated any of those peatlands because they say there's just too many, it's just too complex. And so they got away with it. And we continue to do that right across the countries because we have not established a real dollar value on peat. Quebec is doing it, but I think it needs to be done. And it shouldn't be done by conservationists. I think it should be done by real accountants coming in and saying, what is the value of this? And you could break it down. Is that how much is a moose or a caribou worth to, a family in the Yukon? Instead of, say, buying meat that's imported from Alberta, beef that's imported, or chicken that's imported from Alberta or British Columbia. What's the value of a peatland in slowing or stopping a wildfire that may cause, tens of millions of dollars in damages? What's the importance of it filtering water so that, the fish populations can be sustained in a warming world? Because you get a combination of warming waters and more acidic conditions in rivers, your grayling are going to disappear first, then the lake trout, then other fish. I think this is what really is missing in a lot of policies, and I'm not just pointing the blame at the Yukon or suggesting that they're going about it all wrong, is that I think it just has to be much more comprehensive.
Thank you. It's always challenging to quantify the economic value of things that aren't easily measured in deliverables or products. I've got a question out of the chat, Q&A first, and then a few in the chat. So from the Q&A, Ed, maybe I missed it in your presentation, but can you say something about the old growth nature of peatlands? That is, many peatland specialists, for example, dragonflies, depend on fen vegetation structure that takes hundreds or more, maybe thousands of years to develop.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there's a peatland, extraordinary peatland, which I think is very typical of peatlands in Western Canada, just outside the city of Edmonton, that's about 4,000, 5,000 years old. But it's remarkable for the fact that it has 6,000 arthropods. It has virtually every species of owl that's represented. It used to have Bonaparte's gull, which is the only gull that nests. It has, I think it's 1,500 wasps that are basically new to nature, or have not been named. So there's a treasure trove of, they're relics of the last ice age, really. If you look at the mountain peatlands in the Rockies and Canada and the United States, they're a reminder or a record of what there was 12,000 years ago. They are, like caribou, ice age creatures that survived, and they're still hanging on to these diminishing ecosystems that are extremely resilient. Climate change is going to degrade them to some degree, but consider that peatland in the Mojave Desert, which is 14,000-year-old fen that is still being fed by groundwater that trickled out of those glaciers 14,000, 15,000 years ago. And think about those mosses that Catherine Lafarge took out of a glacier on Ellesmere Island and was able to regrow it back 400 years after it had essentially dried up and shriveled and was frozen. So we've got an ecosystem that's incredibly resilient. They don't burn easily, and some should, but they don't burn easily as forests do. And I go back to something that I've said over and over again to the media, is that we're spending billions to plant 2 billion trees in the country, but we would be much better off. It would be more effective if we protected and wetted the wetlands that we have. That would provide a much bigger bang for the buck than growing trees. In an ideal world, I think we should do both. But the fact is, trees require a lot of fertilizer, and also they can burn down pretty quickly. So you can have 1 million trees burned down in a week in northern Alberta, the Yukon, or the Northwest Territories.
Thanks very much for that. Question out of the chat. This person, Lisa, she also says, thanks for the great presentation. And she asks whether you're aware of any Yukon First Nation-led initiatives to protect Yukon peatlands.
I know I've talked to the people in Dawson who are in the Dawson area, who are very concerned about the expansion of the placer mines in that part of the world. But I'm really not aware, and it's not because it's not happening. It's just that I haven't really followed it up closely enough. But I think that we're really seeing a shift across Canada of a lot of Indigenous communities recognizing the importance of these ecosystems. There's one study that was done in association with the Cree in Quebec, found that in their area, there were 546 pharmaceuticals that they use that grow in peatlands. And the Hudson Bay lowlands, the Cree there have also come to the conclusion that this Ring of Fire proposal that the Ontario government is promoting fairly vigorously is going to have a huge impact on basically their grocery store and also the water that they drink. And in the Northwest Territories, we've seen the Sawtooth people just basically making the decision, 10,000 square kilometers, let's set it aside. This is where we're going to have our food and our pharmaceuticals for, as long as we're around, whereas oil and gas and mining will only be there for 10, 20 years and leave a very big footprint.
Thanks for that answer. Another question from Lisa. Do you know of any peatland tourism experiences offered by anyone globally?
Oh, sure. Yeah, this is a growing business. I mean, you look at Oak Hammock Marsh in Manitoba. I think that they have, it's almost like a pilgrimage that it's managed, I think, by Ducks Unlimited, but they have an awful lot of people coming through there. There are a number in Ontario. Sifton Bog, for example, is another example of people, school kids going through. And then you have, I think the opportunities are limitless because we tend to see peatlands as these soggy, boggy, sometimes smelly ecosystems. But, there are places like the peatlands in Ivavik National Park, the Burwash Uplands, even around Marsh and Bates Lake. They're all around the Yukon. We've just avoided them because they tend to be difficult to walk on. But you can get into a boat and paddle through them. And you'll end up seeing a heck of a lot more. And I take people on tours of peatlands and show them, here where I am in Edmonton, that, I can take to a place where you have 12, 14 species of orchids that you can readily see. And people are just floored by it, because if you've seen a lady slippered orchid, it really is enchanting. It looks like, a fairy cobbled it together. And you see, here's another example. If you want to see black bears, the highest concentration of black bears in the world are found in peatlands. And I didn't know that before writing the book, but in Minnesota, they claim to have the highest concentration of black bears in the Marcel Experimental Forest, which is a peatland. The Great Dismal Swamp in North Carolina, Virginia claims it has the highest concentration of black bears. The reality is, I don't think we really know, but the fact is that a peatland offers a bear, grizzly or black bear, pretty much everything it needs to survive. And so there are naturally high concentrations because you have a lot of berries, a lot of root vegetables that grow there. And you also have the prey. The number of deer, for example, in the Great Dismal Swamp and the Marcel Experimental Forest are enormous. And caribou spend 40 to 60% of their time in peatlands for similar reasons. So there's a concentration of wildlife that we don't appreciate for the fact that we don't go into them. They're just they're hard to travel through. I mean, I can remember on my first caribou hunt in the Northwest Territories at Courageous Lake, we, close to the end of the trip, we finally got our caribou, but they were, about 5 Ks from the camp. And trying to haul those animals as the sun was setting, the carcasses back to our canoes was quite the chore, because, with the added weight of, say, 80 pounds in a backpack, you can sink a lot farther you can without all of that weight. So I think that the opportunities are limitless. And the states are figuring this out. Some Some organizations in Ontario are also figuring it out. And so I think there's a lot of future possibilities there.
Thank you very much for that answer. We probably have time for one last question. This comes from Allison. How long does it take to actually restore a peatland?
To its full, value, it would take, hundreds of years. But I've seen peatlands that have been restored starting to pay huge dividends just 10, 20 years after. And ironically, these are peatlands that are being restored by peat moss harvesting companies who recognize that basically the day is going to come when they're not going to be allowed to expand their footprint. So they're restoring, they've been hiring scientists to restore them. And I've been taken to places where, virtually 80, in some places, 87% of the plant species have returned within 10, 20 years, which says an awful lot. What I'm skeptical about is that there's so many other things below the ground that we don't measure, and on any level. I mean, it's one of the areas of science that I think have been overlooked. So I think there's still an awful lot to be learned, but it certainly is promising. And a slightly disturbed peatland, all it really requires is bringing back some water and some seeds. It doesn't like fertilizer because they generally tend to be acidic, and fertilizers will undo that. So yeah, in the real world, it takes hundreds, thousands of years. But we can do an awful lot to restore those that, haven't been totally mined out, like those in the oil sands. I mean, they're probably never going to come back, even though they're trying, because it's just been degraded too badly.
Thank you very much for that. And thanks for an excellent talk and all the answers you've given. It's definitely an area that many of us can learn more about and maybe explore in person. And I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
I enjoyed it. I wish I could be there.
Maybe next time.
Okay.
So thanks to everyone who joined us as well. I know there are some folks who will be watching for the recording, so I'll send out the link in an upcoming e-newsletter, or you're welcome to reach out to me at scope@yukon.ca for the link if you want it more quickly. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.